Hi, this is Matt at LSAT Lab, and today's lesson is on strengthening questions in the logical reasoning section. Strengthening questions are a fairly common question type. About 7% of all logical reasoning questions are strengthening questions. But more importantly than that, it's the kind of thinking that pays off on strengthening questions also pays off on weakening questions and paradox questions. So it's really worth your while to get better at strengthening questions, since it will immediately pay off on weaken and on paradox questions as well. We're going to cover the following 4 things in today's lesson. So how to spot a strengthening question, what the process is that you want to use when approaching one, what are the common reasoning structures you want to be aware of when you're working on strengthening questions, and what are the trap answer patterns you need to be aware of in order to get rid of those last remaining tempting but wrong choices. When it comes to identifying a strengthening question, we're going to use language in the question stem to help us spot whether it's a strengthening question or any other question type. We identify the question type in the question stem, and we're looking for language cues that suggest that we're looking to make the argument better than it was before. In this question stem, it says, which one of the following most strengthens the argument above? Well, the words most strengthens tells us that we're on a strengthening question. And in this one, the words most supports plays the same role as most strengthens in the previous one. In this one, we get the question, which one of the following, if true, would most justify the argument above? And the words most justify play the same role as most strengthens or most supports. We typically get the combination of making the argument better, whether that's strengthening or supporting or justifying, and also a degree of the most impact possible. So it's really common to see the word most in the question stem. In this question stem, we get each of the following, if true, strengthens the reasoning above, except. Well, the word strengthens is familiar, so we know we're on a strengthening question, but that except is implying that 4 of the answer choices are going to make the argument better. The one that doesn't is the right answer. And not strengthening the argument could mean that it's irrelevant, that the answer choice is not having any impact on the argument, or it could mean that the answer choice is undermining the argument. Except questions are going to be more prevalent on strengthening questions, weakening questions, and paradox questions. Because there's so many things that could have an impact on making the argument better or worse, except questions are much more common on these types of questions. The process that you want to take when you're approaching a strengthening question is the same as every other question type in the assumption family. So that's for sufficient assumption questions, necessary assumption questions, flaw questions, strengthening questions, and weakening questions. We always want to do the same thing. We want to start by finding the conclusion of the argument, then identifying the evidence that is used to support that conclusion. The evaluation step is always going to contain, no, it does not follow from the evidence. We know that the conclusion will not be proven to be true. And what we need to do is figure out why the conclusion is not proven true. If we can figure out what's the gap between what the evidence establishes and what the conclusion is asserting, then we can properly figure out how to make the argument better. To assist us when our intuition fails us in the step of evaluating an argument, we're going to use reasoning structures to better understand the shape and contours of the argument. And that will give us a better picture of what's the missing piece inside of it. And then once we have the gap in the argument, we can use that to anticipate what the answer would sound like. And then when we go to the choices, we're looking for that anticipation, but also understanding the trap answer patterns in order to make eliminations. So here's an example question. Go ahead and try this one on your own. Hit pause. And when you're ready to discuss this together, hit play again. And we'll come back and work it through. All right, welcome back. We want to start by finding the argument's conclusion on this one. And to do that, we're going to look for language cues, ones that introduce conclusions. If we look at the beginning of the second sentence, we get the word thus. And that is telling us that what comes after is in all likelihood the conclusion. It says that cognitive psychotherapy is likely to be more effective at helping patients overcome psychological problems than are forms of psychotherapy that focus on changing unconscious beliefs and desires. Then we get the word since right afterwards. Right? So that's telling us that what comes at the end is actually evidence for why what comes after the word thus is true. If we look at that conclusion carefully, we notice that it's a comparison. It's comparing cognitive psychotherapy and other forms of psychotherapy that focus on changing unconscious beliefs and desires. Right? And they say that cognitive psychotherapy is likely to be more effective. So more effective is giving us that comparison between the two. Comparison is going to be a very common reasoning structure on strengthening questions. 72% of strengthening questions involve comparative reasoning. So we want to really be on the lookout for a comparison being made between, let's say, two different things at a point in time, like in this case, or one thing being compared over two different points in time, let's say the population of city A today versus the population of city A 10 years ago. Comparisons are super important, and if you can recognize that reasoning structure, it'll help you better perceive the gap. If we come back and take a look at this conclusion again, essentially what we have is this comparison between cognitive psychotherapy and other forms of psychotherapy, and they give us some information. They tell us that cognitive psychotherapy is more effective, right? So it's the winner. And also that those other forms of psychotherapy that are being compared, those are the ones that are focusing on changing unconscious beliefs and desires. Now, we also get in the first sentence that cognitive psychotherapy focuses on changing a patient's conscious beliefs. So there's the contrast between cognitive psychotherapy and other types of psychotherapy, whether or not we're focusing on changing a patient's conscious beliefs. And then in the last sentence, we get only conscious beliefs are under the patient's direct conscious control. So what's interesting about this one is that that last premise is actually using the word only, which is a conditional relationship. Only conscious beliefs are under the patient's direct conscious control. Only is a word that introduces a necessary condition. So not only do we have comparison in this argument, but we also have conditional logic. And we can say that that's building a relationship between something that is under a patient's direct conscious control and conscious beliefs. So if something is under their conscious control, then it has to be a conscious belief. Now, conditional logic is going to play a less important role on strengthening questions. In fact, it's probably the least important reasoning structure on strengthening questions. 22% of strengthening questions do involve conditional relationships, though. So back to the argument again. Now, if we go to try to figure out what's the gap in the reasoning, now that we have the evidence and the conclusion, we're looking for a way in which the evidence might connect together. And we have this comparison between cognitive psychotherapy that focuses on conscious beliefs and other types of psychotherapy that focus on unconscious beliefs. And then they tell us that if something is within a patient's direct conscious control, then it must be a conscious belief. If we try to connect that conditional relationship to the fact that cognitive psychotherapy is focused on conscious beliefs, we can't link them together because the common term, conscious beliefs, is in the necessary condition, the right side of the if-then arrow. Right? To try to connect them would mean that we're going to go backwards across that arrow, which is mistaking as sufficient for necessary condition, and we shouldn't do it. But if we take the contrapositive of that second premise and say that if something is not a conscious belief, then it's not under one's direct conscious control, now we can tie this conditional relationship together with the comparison, because those other types of psychotherapy, which are not focused on conscious beliefs, right, then they're not focused on things that are under the patient's direct conscious control. And so we can link them together to better see where this argument is going to go. Now, apparently, by having them focus on things that are not under their direct conscious control, that is somehow less effective than focusing on things that are conscious beliefs. We're looking for not conscious control is some way negative. If we can find not conscious control is some way negative, or that conscious control is somehow positive, that would be a good start in making this argument better. Answer choice A says that psychological problems are frequently caused by unconscious beliefs that could be changed with the aid of psychotherapy. So this is definitely in the right ballpark. It's talking about psychotherapy and problems that could be changed. We're talking about problems that are caused by unconscious beliefs. The issue with answer choice A is that it says that there are problems that are caused by unconscious beliefs that could be changed with the aid of psychotherapy. And if these unconscious beliefs could be changed with the aid of psychotherapy, that seems to suggest that psychotherapy that focuses on unconscious beliefs could actually have a real impact. Right? This is going to make it more likely that such psychotherapy is going to have a positive impact in the world and would actually undermine the argument's conclusion. So let's get rid of A because it's actually working against the argument. Answer choice B says it is difficult for any form of psychotherapy to be effective without focusing on mental states that are under the patient's direct conscious control. So now this is building a relationship. It's difficult for a type or form of psychotherapy to be effective without focusing on mental states that are under their direct conscious control. And the key here is the words difficult to do this without. So you can't do it without. And when you see that structure, that's essentially building an if-then relationship. And we can say to be effective, it's not going to be effective unless it's under their direct conscious control. And we can take what comes after the word without and put it into the necessary condition of an if-then relationship, conscious control, and take the other side, difficult for any type of psychotherapy to be effective, without. So what's the opposite of it being difficult? If it's going to be effective, right, then it has to focus on mental states that are under the patient's direct conscious control. If we take the contrapositive of this, we get that if it's not under the patient's direct conscious control, then it's not going to be effective, or it's going to be difficult for it to be effective. And this would put a negative consequence on a characteristic that we know is associated with those other types of psychotherapy. This is pretty good because it's leading a line from types of psychotherapy that are focused on unconscious beliefs, and those, by focusing on unconscious beliefs, are focusing on things that are not within the patient's direct conscious control. And by focusing on things that are not within the patient's direct conscious control, it's not going to be effective. So it definitely makes the argument better by hurting psychotherapy that focuses on unconscious beliefs. So let's hold on to B and let's see what C gives us. Answer choice C says that cognitive psychotherapy is the only form of psychotherapy that focuses primarily on changing the patient's conscious beliefs. So answer choice C is essentially limiting the kinds of psychotherapy that focus on changing a patient's conscious beliefs to just cognitive psychotherapy. So essentially C is saying there are no other forms of psychotherapy other than cognitive psychotherapy that do this, that focus on conscious beliefs. But whether or not there are other types that focus on changing conscious beliefs does not matter, because the argument's conclusion is a comparison between a type of psychotherapy that focuses on conscious beliefs, namely cognitive psychotherapy, and other types of psychotherapy that focus on changing unconscious beliefs. And whether there are other types of psychotherapy out there does not matter to this particular comparison between cognitive psychotherapy and psychotherapy that focuses on unconscious beliefs. So answer choice C is essentially a relationship that limits the types of psychotherapy that focus on conscious beliefs to just cognitive psychotherapy, and that relationship is simply irrelevant to the argument. We don't care about whether there are other types out there. So let's get rid of C. Answer choice D says that no form of psychotherapy that focuses on changing the patient's unconscious beliefs and desires can be effective unless it also helps change beliefs that are under the patient's direct conscious control. So we see the word unless in there, which is very much like the word without from answer choice B, giving us a conditional relationship. So we can set this up as an if-then idea. Whatever comes after unless is going to go on the necessary condition, the right side of the arrow, and then we're going to negate the other term and pop it into the sufficient condition. So we'll put conscious control on the right side of the if-then relationship, and on the left side says that no form of psychotherapy that focuses on changing the patient's unconscious beliefs and desires can be effective. Right? So they're saying it won't be effective. The opposite of that is that it can be effective. So if the psychotherapy does focus on unconscious beliefs and it is effective, then it must focus on changing beliefs that are under the patient's direct conscious control. Now, this is essentially contradicting the second premise, which says that if unconscious beliefs, then not conscious control. Well, we have unconscious beliefs on the left side of the arrow, right? We have more than that on the left side of the arrow, effective and unconscious beliefs. But instead of leading to not conscious control, it says conscious control. This literally contradicts the second premise. Right? So this is going to undermine the argument by undermining the argument's support. Let's get rid of it. Answer choice E says that all of a patient's conscious beliefs are under the patient's conscious control. But other psychological states cannot be controlled effectively without the aid of psychotherapy. Well, other psychological states aren't relevant, so we're going to focus on the first half of answer choice E. All of a patient's conscious beliefs are under the patient's conscious control. Now, the word all gives us an if-then relationship, and it tells us that conscious beliefs goes on the left and conscious control goes on the right of this if-then relationship. So if we look at this, it's essentially the negation of that second premise. Unconscious beliefs to not conscious control. This one says conscious beliefs to conscious control. Right? This would help us establish that cognitive psychotherapy is focused on things that are relating to their conscious control, while psychotherapy that focuses on unconscious beliefs is not focused on beliefs that are under the patient's direct conscious control. Right? That gives us a clear distinction between the two types, but it doesn't actually tell us whether one's better or not. So it doesn't make the argument any better. So this is essentially a negation of that second premise, and that negation doesn't make the argument any better. And so that takes us back to answer choice B as the correct answer. Here's another example. Go ahead and give this a try. Hit pause, and when you're ready to discuss, when you think you've got the right answer, go ahead and hit play again, and we'll discuss it together. All right, welcome back. So where's the conclusion of this argument? We always want to start with the conclusion. We're looking for those language cues, and in this case, it's really hard to spot, but at the very end of this argument, we see that word so, which is just like the word thus or therefore or hence, telling us that the last clause of this argument is the conclusion. The research suggests that a diet may not have to be extremely low in fat in order to protect the heart. So what's the evidence for that? Well, before that word so, we get this word but, which sometimes means a pivot, sometimes it means and. Right? But the Mediterranean diet includes a fair amount of fish. Well, it's hard to piece that together. Let's go ahead and focus back up on the first part of the argument here. In a recent study of more than 400 North American men and women whose previous heart attack put them at risk for a second heart attack, about half were told to switch to a Mediterranean-type diet, one rich in fish, vegetables, olive oil, and grains, while the other half were advised to eat a more traditional Western diet, but to limit their fat intake. Okay, there's a lot of information in there, so let's unpack that for a second. We have these people who have had a heart attack and who are at risk of having another. Right? And given some the recommendation to adopt a Mediterranean-type diet, and the others to maintain a Western diet, but just to limit their fat intake. So the first thing we notice is that this is a comparison again. 72% of all strengthening questions involve a comparison. So the comparison being made here is between those being put on the Mediterranean type diet and those that are being put on the Western diet. And we've given a lot of information there. Those on the Mediterranean diet were eating fish, vegetables, olive oil, and grains. Those on the Western diet, well, they were told to eat less fat. And about half of the participants were on the Mediterranean diet, and about half of the participants were on the Western diet. Now, the next sentence gives us that those following the Mediterranean diet were significantly less likely than those in the other group to have a second heart attack. So in terms of which one was better for the patients, it turns out that the Mediterranean diet was better, that they were less likely to have that heart attack. But why? We don't know. What we're given is essentially a correlation between the type of diet that they were eating and the outcome, the thing that we observed, a reduction in the risk of our heart attack. Now, the last premise says that the Mediterranean diet includes a fair amount of fat from fish and olive oil. Right? So there's that contrast being set up between the Western diet, which in this case was being modified to be low fat, and the Mediterranean diet, which is just naturally more high in fat. So if we come back to the conclusion, it says that the research suggests that a diet may not have to be extremely low in fat in order to protect the heart. The first thing that catches my attention there is that they're suggesting that the Mediterranean diet caused the protection of the heart, that it was the thing that led to the lower risk of having a heart attack. Well, we've got a correlation established between those on the Mediterranean diet and those with the less likely to have a second heart attack, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it was the diet that caused that result. So one issue I have with this argument is that it's mistaking a correlation for cause and effect relationship, and notice that the cause and effect relationship is in the conclusion. Causation is going to play a role in about 33% of strengthening questions, and you really want to be on the lookout for them to assert causation after merely ascertaining a correlation between two events. Then you can start to figure out how to make that argument better. Typically, you want to rule out alternative causes, or show that when the cause is present, the effect is present, or that when the effect is absent, or that when the cause is absent, the effect is absent. So strengthening the correlation or ruling out alternative causes will make their argument a little bit better by making that causal relationship a little bit more likely to be true. So we come back to the answer choices here, and answer choice A says that research has shown that eliminating almost all fat from one's diet can be effective in decreasing the likelihood of a second heart attack. Well, eliminating almost all fat, that sounds very much like the Western diet, which was low in fat. And if low in fat is effective in decreasing the likelihood of a second heart attack, that's actually working against the argument, which is that the Mediterranean diet did a better job. Right? Answer choice A seems to be working in the wrong direction by making the Western diet more appealing. Right? So this actually is going to weaken the argument. Let's get rid of A. Answer choice B says, studies suggest that the kinds of oils in the fat included in the Mediterranean diet may protect the heart against potentially fatal disruptions of heart rhythms and other causes of heart attacks. So this is telling us a mechanism by which the causation can occur. It's that the kinds of oils in the fat included in the Mediterranean diet were actually having this protective characteristic. This sounds like it's going to make the conclusion more likely to be true, that it was the Mediterranean diet that reduced the heart attacks. So let's hold on to answer choice B and look at answer choice C. The patients who consumed the Mediterranean diet enjoyed the food and continued to follow the diet after the experiment was concluded. Well, that the patients enjoyed the food is not relevant to whether it helped them or not. Enjoying the food maybe makes you more likely to eat it, but it doesn't make it more likely to have a certain impact on you. So answer choice C is bringing up a point that's simply out of scope, not relevant to this argument. Answer choice D says that many people who have had heart attacks are advised by their cardiologists to begin an exercise regimen in addition to changing their diet. Well, it doesn't really tell you how they're being recommended to change their diet. Does that mean increase their fat intake, lower their fat intake, go to a Mediterranean diet, go to a Western diet? It's a little bit vague, which is going to make it difficult for this to support the argument. Furthermore, this is talking about what's true for many people, and many on the LSAT could be 2 or more. So we're not necessarily talking about a large number of people here. What they're being advised to do for just a couple of people without actually telling us how they're being advised to change their diet, this is simply too weak to have an impact on the argument. Answer choice E says that some cardiologists believe that the protection afforded by the Mediterranean diet might be enhanced by drugs that lower blood cholesterol levels. So this seems like it might be suggesting that there is protection afforded by the Mediterranean diet. The problem with answer choice E is that it's about what these cardiologists believe. And what they believe to be the case may not turn out to be the case. This is simply an opinion, not a fact. And it's only true for some people. Like that could be 1 person or 2 people or 3. We don't know how many cardiologists hold this belief. So it's a belief, it's not fact, and it's for some cardiologists, which is very weak. Typically what they believe is not relevant. It's going to be out of scope to the fact of what's actually happening. So that takes us back to answer choice B as the right answer. So now if we look at the trap answer patterns that we find prevalent on strengthening questions, out of scope is going to be a really common one. 30% of wrong answers are wrong because they're simply out of scope, not relevant to the argument at hand. 28% of wrong answers are wrong because they're weakening the argument instead of strengthening it. They're having the opposite impact of what they're supposed to. 9% of wrong answers are wrong because they're building a relationship between terms that aren't relevant to the argument. 7% are wrong because they're supporting the evidence as opposed to supporting the argument. Remember, we only care about validity. We don't care about soundness. So we only care about whether the evidence, if true, would establish the conclusion. We don't actually care whether the evidence is indeed true. So providing a claim that makes the evidence more likely to be true doesn't actually make the argument any better. We've already assumed the evidence was true in the first place. 26% of wrong answers are wrong because they're too weak. They include the words some or many or often. Essentially, they include terms that make the answer choice so weak that it's not strong enough to actually impact the argument's conclusion. So in summary, you spot a strengthening question with language in the question stem, either looking for words like strengthens, supports, or justifies, and be on the lookout for more accept questions than normal when working on strengthening questions. The reasoning structures you really want to be on the lookout for are comparison at 72% of arguments and causation, 33%. Conditional logic is present, but it's less dominant in this particular question type. The trap answers you really need to know about are those answer choices that are out of scope, those that weaken the argument instead of strengthening it, those that are too weak to have an impact on the argument, those that build an irrelevant relationship between terms, a relationship that doesn't have any impact on the argument, and those that are supporting the evidence as opposed to supporting the argument. So that's it for today's lesson on strengthening questions. I invite you to check out these other video lessons or visit us today at lsatlab.com.